All right, this is our Boughton Law legal series. My name is Mike Eckford, and Boughton Law, of course, we're very happy to have them as our on-air legal analysts for the year. And we also take the opportunity to have them on to talk about all kinds of different issues from a legal perspective and some of the advantages that you can gain by working with great lawyers and the opportunities that can be provided in that. And you know, we talk about First Nations and negotiation a lot on this station, but we don't often talk about what is the new reality in Canada. I mean, the Supreme Court of Canada granted declaration of Aboriginal title to the Silcotin First Nation, and it changed a lot of people's perspective on what was possible in BC, because for so long there's been uncertainty when it comes to dealing with First Nations as a business. Now there's some certainty and some clarity when it comes around resource rights and actually getting into negotiations on the business side. So the topic today, doing business with First Nations. We are joined by Jean Ewan. She practices First Nations and Aboriginal law with Boughton Law. Hi, Jean. How are you?
Fine. Thanks, Mike.
Good. You know, I'm going to throw you a bit of a curveball right off the bat. I'm curious as to how you got involved in this particular area of the law. What was it that attracted you to looking at this and studying this?
I started working with a senior lawyer early on in my career, and it grabbed my interest from the very beginning. It's fascinating. It's been a great experience working with First Nation groups. It was a different experience. You know, I was working with businesses primarily before I joined a senior practitioner whose practice was with First Nations, and it's been a great experience.
Well, and you've seen changes, and we're not going to focus on the legal aspects of the Supreme Court, but you have seen some fairly significant changes when it comes to Aboriginal title and the rights of First Nations in British Columbia specifically.
Absolutely right.
Okay, so let's talk about the business side of it. And when people talk about, partnership agreements, partnership arrangement with First Nations, who are we talking about? Who would or should be interested in partnership arrangements with First Nations?
There are many reasons, really, why businesses would want to get into a partnership arrangement with First Nations. First of all, generally speaking, you'll find that First Nations are not as interested in receiving passive income. First Nations want to be engaged. Many First Nations want to have an ownership interest in projects happening on their lands. And so it may be that for a business wanting to do a development on treaty or reserve lands, it may be a prerequisite for them in order for them to proceed with that project. They need to engage the First Nation, not just as sort of the quasi-landlord, but to engage them as a business partner and give them an equity, not give them, but have them be an equity owner.
Jean, is there some uncertainty sometimes for businesses when they think about this because of all the complications that we've seen that are very well publicized around treaty negotiations? And people go, well, it's not even possible, right? I have to go through a government or a commission or something before I can negotiate directly with First Nations. That's not true at all, is it?
No, not at all. What has to be recognized is that there's many types of First Nation lands. When people talk about First Nation lands, that really encompasses a whole range of different land management regimes. So at one end, you've got land regimes, what we call First Nation lands or reserve lands, where First Nations have less autonomy over. And yes, you do then have to go to the federal government. Those are reserve lands. You have to go to the federal government. Federal government is still the title holder. They have to approve any sort of lease arrangements or anything on reserve lands. But at the other end, you've got treaty lands where First Nations have complete control over their lands. They have title to their lands. They can they develop their own rules and procedures. So there's quite a spectrum. So you have to understand what type of land, what type of First Nation lands are you dealing with when you're contemplating a project on First Nation lands. So
why enter into the partnership agreements and arrangements with First Nations? What's the main motivation for business?
Different reasons. I think that partnerships with First Nations can be very helpful to ensure the long-term success of a project. If a new project is being proposed on a traditional territory of a First Nation or First Nations, having the stakeholder, title holder involved, it's a really good way to ensure that the stakeholders and the important key holders are involved and have vested interest in the success of the project.
Well, and that's part, we're using the term partnership because you mentioned right off the bat the value of that idea, that idea of partnership working along with, First Nations can gain you business advantages. And people don't recognize this. I mean, one of the notes that I had before this was the secure contracting opportunities for their partnerships not otherwise available to non-First Nation partnerships. What does that actually mean?
Well, governments have implemented a number of initiatives to share revenues with First Nations, especially for those projects taking place in the traditional territory of First Nations. And also giving out, providing contracting opportunities that give preference to First Nation partnerships, or First Nations. So if you are a private business and you don't have that First Nation connection, you may not have access to those contracting opportunities that's put forward by government, for example, that are designed to address Aboriginal issues.
Well, and I would guess that would also play into that idea of just expediting or making it more streamlined, that whole idea of the business process when dealing with different organizations and different First Nations as well. I mean, speed enters into that for business as well because you're dealing with the stakeholder.
Right.
Okay. We're going to take a break and we're going to come back and we're going to talk about a few other issues as well. What private sectors should consider when negotiating partnership agreements with First Nations. Obviously, there's a lot of things in here to address in BC, and a lot of BC businesses are starting to take advantage of these opportunities. We'll talk about that next on the Mike Eckford Show on CKNW News Talk 980. You're listening to the Mike Eckford Show on CKNW News Talk 980. It's our Boughton Law Legal Series. They are our on-air legal analysts for this year, and we're happy to have them. And it also means we can access their expertise on all kinds of issues. And I will admit a personal fascination with this one because I grew up on the Sunshine Coast, and the Seashell Nation up there was one of the first to achieve self-governance in Canada. And I have seen that model blossom. Why has it blossomed? Because there's certainty for business when they're entering partnerships with the Seashell Nation, and it has gone very, very well for them, and they've certainly created a nice roadmap. So I wanted to do this subject, doing business with First Nations. Jean Ewan joining us from Boughton Law. She specializes in Aboriginal law, and we've been talking about all kinds of issues. So, Jean, let's continue, and what should people have in mind? So private sectors, what should they be considering when they're negotiating partnership arrangements with First Nations in BC?
There has to be, I think, a recognition that First Nations are not a homogeneous group. That may seem obvious, but the spectrum could be quite wide. On the one hand, you could be dealing with a First Nation and you're putting in front of them the first business proposal that they've ever considered because they're perhaps from a remote part of BC, and this is all new to them, doing business. On the other hand, you could be dealing with a very sophisticated First Nation that has had many successful, business ventures before them, and they've got a whole economic development arm set up to deal with businesses approaching them and what are things to consider, and they've got accountants and lawyers working for them.
Know who you're partnering with would be, and understand some of that as well that's going on. What about the themes and that idea of, and you've mentioned it a few times, the relationships and the partnerships, because that obviously seems to be a big aspect when you talk about business working with First Nations, is that idea of partnership and that relationship building.
Relationship building, I think, is important to any sort of partnerships, but especially so in First Nations. From my experience, sometimes it takes longer to negotiate a partnership arrangement with a First Nation because, from my experience, First Nations very value their relationship very, very much so. They want to work with a partner that they can trust. And so sometimes it can take longer than what a business would be used to in terms of negotiating a shareholders agreement, partnership agreement, joint venture agreement. But don't see that as wasted time. See that as investment in relationship building. Well,
and I guess that offers lots of opportunities as well. And I know, again, going back to, a lot of the people that I know in the Seashell Nation, some of those aspects and some of the negotiations with private companies and private entities have involved training programs and sort of, and that's the way that the partnerships have been valued and built within that as well. And that's all negotiated.
Right. Unlike a private business where perhaps the the key focus in negotiating a partnership arrangement is
money.
How do we make money? What is the best way to make money, and how can the partners make money together? Of course, that's important, and that's a big part of any sort of partnership. But with First Nation, often you'll find, and almost inevitably, First Nations are looking for a business that will generate contracting and employment opportunities for their members. How will this partnership generate those? And I think the parties' expectations have to be clear. Are there going to be a lot of jobs? Is this the type of venture that's going to generate a lot of jobs? Perhaps the venture will generate a lot of jobs at the beginning stages, perhaps in the construction, but once the project's up and running, maybe there aren't many jobs. So it's important to clarify that, what kind of contracting and employment opportunities will be available, and are there qualified individuals who can feed into the business.
And as a lawyer, I would imagine that clarity means documentation for you and making sure that things are there in a document.
Yeah. It's important to clarify the party's expectation and to write them down, put them in a formal agreement. For example, one of the things that come up is you get a private business in the First Nation talking about wanting to form a partnership arrangement. Then I say, okay, what is the business you're wanting to pursue? So that's explained to me. And then my next question is, okay, say if it's construction, can either partner join up with other partners to pursue construction opportunities during the lifetime of this partnership? Is this a dating game, or is this a marriage, or what is it? Is it a limited
is this
term
for life?
Yes.
Give us let's end this way, some examples of how this has worked, that private sector First Nation partnership.
There are many successful models out there. Residential development, for example. Currently off the top of my head, I can think of a residential development happening where there's a First Nation and private business partnership, and it's worked really well because the First Nation has governing powers. It has a stake in the project, so it has a vested interest in making sure the partnership works and is happening on their lands. And also, by having the First Nation component, there was actually tax advantages to the partnership that wouldn't otherwise be available to just a private business doing. So
a business advantage right in there. So it works on multiple levels. All right, great, fascinating stuff. Once again, everybody has more clarity around the legal landscape when it comes to title and how that title has been dealt with by the Supreme Court of Canada and all kinds of different courts and levels as well. So this is an opportunity for British Columbia businesses, and that's what I keep hearing from business after business is they have clarity now, and that's what business likes, clarity. How do we proceed forward? How do we make these partnerships happen? Jean Ewan, thank you so much. Of course, you can contact Boughton Law and Jean if you ever want advice on any of these issues. Really appreciate your time today, Jean. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
You've got it on the Mike Eckford Show on CKNW News Talk 980. I should clarify as well, because Boughton Law, I don't want to get in trouble with Boughton Law, full of lawyers. Nothing that we said during the segment can be used as legal advice. You have to contact a lawyer to make sure that you are getting that directly from them. Once again, the Mike Eckford Show on CKNW, Drex Live, coming up next.